travelers were the moving shadows of the 14th century. They passed along roads that connected villages, towns, and growing cities, carrying news, goods, and rumors. But with every step into a place that was not their own, they became subjects of whispers. People noticed them immediately. Strangers could never blend in fully, not with their clothes dusted from distant roads, their speech colored by unfamiliar accents, their mannerisms just a shade different from local ways. The moment a traveler appeared, people leaned closer, lowered their voices, and spoke about them in tones half curious, half cautious. Why did locals whisper? Because in a world without passports, photographs, or written identities that followed a person, a stranger was an unknown quantity. Was this person a merchant bringing useful wares? Was he a messenger with news from beyond the horizon? Or was he a thief, a wanderer with no honest ties, someone who might bring trouble? In the absence of certainty, whispers filled the gaps. Hello everyone, and welcome. Before we journey deeper into this forgotten world, I'll gently ask you to subscribe. Just as the whispers followed travelers wherever they went, you can follow along here so you don't miss the next story when it arrives. Now, imagine standing at a marketplace as a stranger entered. The market was already noisy. Vendors calling out prices, buyers haggling, children darting between stalls. But when the traveler stepped in, eyes shifted. A pause fluttered through the air like a ripple across water. Some pretended not to notice, but still watched from the corners of their eyes. Others were more direct, nudging companions and tilting their heads toward the newcomer. And then came the murmurs. Who is he? Where is he from? Why does he walk alone? The whispers often began with clothing. Clothes told stories before mouths opened. Was the traveler's cloak patched or new? Were the shoes sturdy leather or worn thin? A fine belt suggested wealth. Dust-stained hems suggested long roads and little rest. People whispered judgments in quick breaths. He looks wealthy, which could mean opportunity or danger. His shoes are worn, which could mean hardship or resilience. Every detail became a clue, and whispers became the language of guessing. Then came the matter of accent. A single word, pronounced differently, revealed a stranger's origin. People pricked their ears, catching tones that were not their own. A softer lilt, a harder edge, a rhythm of speech that marked the traveler as an outsider. Whispers followed immediately. He's not from here. Some admired the novelty, some distrusted it, but no one ignored it. Hands and posture mattered, too. A person who walked confidently with eyes raised seemed proud, perhaps too proud. A person who kept their head lowered seemed secretive, perhaps hiding something. Was that hand calloused like a worker's, or smooth like a scribe's? Did the stranger carry tools or only a pouch at the belt? Even these small things became fodder for quiet conversation. The whispers were not only about what a traveler brought with him, but also what he might take away. Villagers worried about strangers who came with sharp eyes, asking too many questions. What was he looking for? Whose house did he glance at too long? Which path did he watch most carefully? Suspicion filled the space where knowledge was missing, and suspicion, once born, spread quickly. But not all whispers were fearful. Some were tinged with admiration. Travelers brought glimpses of other worlds. A different cloak color, a new type of pouch, or even a strange way of tying shoes could spark fascination. Did you see how his boots are laced? Not like ours. These details might inspire imitation or fuel envy, but they also marked the traveler as someone from beyond the ordinary. What made whispers so powerful was that they carried both sides at once. A traveler could be seen as an opportunity, someone bringing goods, stories, and novelty. Yet at the same time, he could be seen as a risk, someone hiding trouble beneath his cloak. Whispers kept both possibilities alive until time revealed which was true. And so a traveler walking into a town never truly walked alone. He was surrounded by voices unseen but constant, carried in hushed tones between neighbors. These whispers followed him as surely as his own shadow, shaping the way people looked at him, whether they smiled in welcome or narrowed their eyes in caution. The 14th century was an age of movement, but it was also an age of closeness. Communities were tight. Everyone knew everyone, and news traveled slowly. In such a world, the presence of a stranger stood out sharply. Whispers filled the gaps left by silence, echoing behind the traveler with every step he took on cobblestones or dirt paths. And for the traveler, these whispers mattered. They could mean the difference between being offered a meal or being turned away, between being trusted with directions or watched with suspicion, between resting safely or spending the night under the stars. In the 14th century, the real journey was not just along roads. It was through the unspoken, judgments of the people whose whispers carried further than he realized. If there was anywhere in the 14th century where whispers grew thickest, it was the marketplace. Travelers who dared step into such places were not only noticed, they were dissected piece by curious eyes and eager tongues. A market was not simply a place to buy and sell. It was a stage alive with voices, colors, and movement. From dawn until the sun leaned westward, stalls crowded the open square or narrow streets, each offering something for trade: baskets of grain, bolts of cloth, barrels of salted fish, tools hammered from iron, and small luxuries like bright dyes or simple trinkets. The noise was constant, but so too were the observations. And into this mix stepped the traveler. He did not need to announce himself. His presence did it for him. Dust on his cloak told one story, the strap of his satchel another. Some traders eyed him hopefully. Perhaps he carried coin. Perhaps he brought rare wares from another town. Perhaps he had stories that could bring buyers closer to their stalls. But the same hopeful gaze could sharpen into suspicion. Was this traveler a thief, scanning the goods too intently? Was he a spy, judging prices, waiting to report back to a rival? The whispers started small. Two stallholders leaned toward one another while weighing grain, muttering about the stranger's posture. Children tugged at mother's sleeves, asking who the dusty man was. A weaver raised her chin, quietly telling her neighbor she did not like the way the traveler looked at her cloth. Soon whispers carried across the square in fragments. He's from the north. No, his shoes look southern. Did you see the clasp on his cloak? That isn't local work. Even the way he paid drew comment. If he used too many coins at once, people wondered how he came by such wealth. If he counted too carefully, people muttered that he was miserly or poor. If he bartered, pressing too hard for better prices, it left murmurs of arrogance. And if he paid too easily, it led to whispers of carelessness. And carelessness invited watchful eyes who might follow him down an alley after dusk. Travelers quickly learned that every gesture echoed louder in the marketplace. Standing too long at one stall suggested greed. Moving too quickly between stalls suggested nervousness. Laughing too freely with one merchant might stir jealousy in another. Even silence could betray. A traveler who said too little seemed unfriendly. A traveler who said too much seemed suspicious. Balance was nearly impossible, and so the whispers filled the gaps. But the marketplace was also where travelers carried the greatest chance to win favor. If they brought small trinkets, spices, or fabrics from afar, whispers turned from suspicion to admiration. "Look at that color. I've never seen cloth like it. Where did he get those beads? If he sells them, I'll be the first to buy." Such admiration could soften hearts, turning whispers into invitations, leading the traveler into friendships or business ties that lasted longer than a day. Still, admiration never entirely silenced fear. Beneath the excitement of novelty always lurked doubt. Was the cloth stolen? Were the beads genuine? Did the traveler's smile hide something? In the 14th century, where proof was scarce and records rare, whispers often carried more weight than fact. People relied on them as warnings, hints, or guidance in deciding whether to trust a stranger. It was not uncommon for travelers to leave markets with more eyes following them than when they arrived. Children might trail behind, curious about how far he had come. Merchants might assign apprentices to shadow him quietly, ensuring he caused no trouble. And villagers, having whispered all day, carried those murmurs back to their homes, where supper was seasoned with speculation. He bought too much grain for one man. His pouch looked heavy. He seemed too eager to leave. For the traveler, the marketplace was both opportunity and trap. He might earn coin, find allies, or exchange news. But he also became the subject of stories he could not control, tales spun out of small gestures he barely remembered making. And these whispers, once seeded in the market, spread beyond it, carried down lanes, across fences, and into doorways where neighbors spoke of him long after he was gone. In this way, the marketplace was not just a center of trade. It was the birthplace of reputations. Travelers learned quickly that their actions in these bustling squares shaped the way entire towns saw them. For in a world where written records were rare, whispers were the most enduring memory a traveler could leave behind. When travelers finished their days on the road, they did not always find silence waiting. The 14th century offered few places for safe rest, but where a traveler laid down his pack, whether in a roadside inn, a way house, or a borrowed corner of a stranger's dwelling, whispers followed him indoors. An inn was more than just a place to sleep. It was a crossroads. Merchants, messengers, wandering craftsmen, and weary villagers shared benches and bowls. Some carried coin, some carried stories, some carried nothing but themselves. Strangers sat shoulder to shoulder, listening with half an ear to words not meant for them. And always beneath the low hum of voices, whispers curled like smoke. The moment a traveler stepped through the door, the tone of the room shifted. The scrape of stools against the floor, the pause of spoons and bowls, subtle but sharp enough for the new arrival to feel it. The whispers began quickly. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why now at this hour when most were already settling for the night? Even the smallest details fed the murmurs. Did the traveler carry a chest or only a pouch? Did he glance too often at the door, as though ready to flee? Did his boots drip with mud from far roads or dust from local lanes? In inns where strangers gathered more often than in villages, the eyes that judged were keener, sharper, quicker to notice signs. Travelers who tried to blend in rarely succeeded. Sitting quietly at a bench still drew attention. Ordering food brought questions. How much did he eat, and what did he choose? Was his appetite hearty, suggesting long hunger on the road, or too light, suggesting caution? Paying brought more whispers still. Did he hand over coin confidently? Did he count each piece too carefully? Or worse, did he hesitate, fumbling as though the pouch carried less than it should? Inns were places of exchange not only of food and rest, but of information. Gossip traveled faster here than on the road itself. If a traveler spoke too freely, telling tales of his journey, the whispers multiplied as each listener retold his words, adding new turns with every repetition. If he spoke too little, silence itself became suspicious. What is he hiding? Became the whispered refrain. Way-houses, simpler shelters by the road, offered no better safety. There, with fewer people and fewer comforts, the closeness was greater. Strangers sat together by a single hearth, their belongings piled close by. In such company every gesture magnified. If a traveler stirred in the night, others noticed. If he rose too early, whispers followed. Even sleep brought no escape, for snoring, tossing, or clutching a pouch too tightly became fodder for suspicion. Whispers at inns and way-houses carried particular weight because they lingered. Locals carried them back to town squares the next morning. Messengers carried them down the road to the next post. A single evening of careless words or gestures could trail behind a traveler for days, retold again and again until even places he had not yet reached already knew his name. The wise traveler learned to tread carefully, not only on the road but in conversation. A word too many might mark him boastful. A word too few might mark him secretive. A laugh too loud might seem careless. A face too stern might seem unfriendly. Balancing in such company was as delicate as balancing on a narrow beam. Few mastered it fully. Yet there were benefits as well. A clever traveler could plant his own whispers. By sharing a tale of bravery, of goods carried, of knowledge gained, he might shape the way others spoke of him. Some turned suspicion into admiration, or at least into curiosity. But this was a dangerous art, for whispers had lives of their own. A story told once became retold with changes, and what began as a simple claim could return as an accusation. The inns and way-houses of the 14th century were crossroads, not only of roads, but of reputations. What people whispered there mattered, because those whispers spread faster than wagons and more enduringly than footprints. A traveler might leave the room the next morning, but his shadow, woven out of murmured words, often left long after him. The marketplace brought its murmurs, the inns carried their suspicions, but perhaps the strangest whispers of all were those that followed travelers even before they arrived anywhere. The roads themselves had reputations, and those reputations clung to the people who walked them. In the 14th century, roads were not simply paths of stone or dirt. They were threads stitching towns and villages together. Some were wide enough for carts to pass side by side, others so narrow that a single rider had to turn sideways to let another by. Travelers stepping onto them knew they were stepping into spaces that belonged not entirely to themselves. but to everyone who used them, and to the rumors that grew upon them. When a traveler appeared on the road leading into a village, the sight often preceded his arrival by hours. Children playing in the fields spotted him first, running back to tell parents. Shepherds noted the figure moving along the horizon and shared the news when they returned with their flocks. By the time the traveler reached the outskirts, whispers had already spread. A stranger is coming. His story began before he even had the chance to open his mouth. Villagers watched closely as he approached. The speed of his walk, the shape of his shadow, even the way he shifted the weight of his pack told a kind of tale. A steady, confident step brought one kind of whisper. Perhaps this was a man of purpose with business to attend. A slower, uneven pace brought another. Perhaps this was someone exhausted or carrying secrets heavier than his bag. Travelers who rode animals drew even sharper attention. Horses were not common property, and their condition spoke volumes. A well-fed, strong horse suggested wealth. A weary, thin animal suggested hardship or overwork. Donkeys or mules bore their own judgments. Whispers about whether the traveler was careful, practical, or merely poor. The road magnified these signs, for in open space there was nothing to distract from the figure of the stranger. Whispers did not wait for travelers to arrive. They flowed ahead of them. A miller spotting a stranger from afar would tell the baker. The baker would mention it to customers. By the time the traveler reached the heart of town, the air was already alive with speculation. People whispered what they thought they saw. His cloak is heavy, maybe full of goods. He looks tired, maybe fleeing something. He has strong boots. Maybe he's been walking for weeks. The traveler himself often had no idea how much he was being discussed. To him the road was long, his feet sore, his throat dry. But to those who watched from fields, windows, and doorways, he was a figure of mystery, worth more words than he could imagine. Even accidents on the road bred whispers. If a strap broke and a bundle tumbled into the dust, children laughed and repeated the tale, making the stranger seem clumsy. If he paused to drink water at a stream, some whispered that he was cautious, taking too long. If he hurried without pause, others whispered that he was in flight from something unseen. Every action, no matter how small, became a seed for murmured stories. There was also the matter of direction. A traveler arriving from the north carried with him the north's reputation, whether for wealth, poverty, or conflict. One arriving from the south carried another. People judged not only the man himself, but also the road that delivered him. And once judged, whispers grew quickly, like smoke curling from a fire. Roadside encounters brought still more voices. Two travelers meeting on the path often exchanged words, sometimes friendly, sometimes wary. But those who watched from afar rarely heard what was said. They filled the silence with their own versions. Did you see them stop? They must know each other. Why did they speak so quickly? Perhaps they shared a secret. Why didn't they speak at all? Perhaps they are enemies. What actually passed between strangers mattered less than what others imagined had been said. Whispers from the road were some of the most dangerous, for they reached places long before the traveler did. A man might arrive at an inn to find that the keeper already had an opinion of him, shaped by gossip carried ahead on the lips of others. He might walk into a market to find buyers hesitant, already murmuring about his reputation. The road was not silent. It was alive with talk, and the talk traveled faster than footsteps. Travelers in the 14th century learned that their journeys were measured not just in miles, but in murmurs. They carried with them not only their goods and their stories, but also the shifting weight of whispers that followed like invisible baggage. And sometimes the whispers that greeted them upon arrival mattered more than the road itself. When a traveler left the road and passed into the heart of a town, his journey did not end at the market stalls or the common squares. Behind doors, within walls, and around hearths, his presence lived on. Whispers followed him into places he could not see. A 14th century town was not vast. Word traveled quickly through narrow lanes and across courtyards. A stranger walking in during the day often became the topic of private discussion by night. Families gathered for their evening meals while quietly debating his appearance. Was he tall or short? Did he look weary or sharp-eyed? Did he carry goods or only a pouch? And most importantly, what did his arrival mean for them? These conversations took on shapes of their own. A weaver's household might whisper about whether the traveler carried cloth from distant places. A blacksmith's family might speculate whether he had tools or rare metals. A merchant's children might wonder if he had coins heavy enough to change tomorrow's trade. Each household saw him through the lens of its own hopes and fears. The voices grew sharper when suspicion crept in. If a lock clicked late at night, someone whispered that the stranger was wandering. If a dog barked, someone whispered that he was outside. Even if he slept quietly, still suspicion wrapped around him like smoke. For in the privacy of homes, imaginations roamed more freely than in the open square. Travelers were rarely aware of this hidden world of whispers. They lay on benches or straw mats, grateful for rest, never realizing that beyond the thin walls, families spoke about them in tones that would decide whether they were welcomed the next day or watched with unease. These closed-door whispers also shaped alliances. A neighbor leaning over a fence might remark, "Did you see the way he carried himself?" The other would answer, "Yes, I thought the same." Agreement spread quickly, forming invisible threads of judgment that could lift a traveler higher or drag him down without his knowing. Sometimes the whispers were kind. A weary face inspired sympathy, and words of pity softened suspicions. "He looked tired, poor man. Perhaps he needs kindness." Such whispers could lead to small gifts, a cup of water, a scrap of bread, directions given more gently. But kindness rarely went untested. Even after such words, people still watched carefully, measuring whether generosity was safe. Other times the whispers turned cruel. A sharp laugh overheard in the market, a glance held too long, a refusal to answer a casual question. Any of these might spark talk that spread quickly. "He's hiding something. He doesn't belong here. Best to keep your distance." These warnings passed quietly between households until the whole street carried them, and the traveler's reputation was stained before he had the chance to defend himself. What made these whispers powerful was their secrecy. Travelers could sense suspicion in the market or at the inn, but the judgments whispered in private homes remained hidden. They only felt the effects: a colder look the next morning, a shorter answer when asking directions, a door closed just a little too firmly. By then, the whispers had already woven their net, and no effort could untangle it. And yet it was in these quiet households that the true reputation of travelers was made. Public words faded with the crowd's noise, but private words lingered. repeated from one evening to the next. Do you remember the stranger who passed through last winter? Yes, the one with the heavy boots. I never liked the look of him. These conversations shaped memory long after the traveler had gone, and in that memory he lived on, judged, remembered, or forgotten. Behind closed doors, the voices of the 14th century shaped the invisible roads of reputation. They revealed the truth of the time, that no traveler walked alone. Even in silence, even in sleep, he was followed by the whispers of those who watched, judged, and speculated. His shadow stretched longer than he knew, cast not by lanterns, but by the quiet conversations of households unseen. And just as those whispers passed from one room to another, this channel carries histories from one day to the next. If you haven't yet, I'll gently remind you to subscribe so you can be here when the next story unfolds. If grown men and women filled towns with whispers about travelers, children added their own notes to the chorus. In the 14th century, children were not hidden away from daily life. They were part of the bustle of markets, the chores of households, and the rhythm of roads. Their eyes were quick, their ears sharper than adults suspected, and their words carried into corners where adults' voices did not reach. Children were often the first to notice a traveler approaching. While adults worked, bent over fields, or hunched across market stalls, it was children who spotted the figure moving on the horizon. They tugged at sleeves, pointed with eager fingers, and called out news before anyone else had seen. Someone's coming, they cried, and with that, the first whispers were born. When the traveler entered the village, children studied him with boldness. They had not yet learned the art of hiding curiosity behind lowered voices. They stared openly, counting the patches on his cloak, noting the dirt on his boots, guessing the weight of his pack. Their eyes measured everything, and then they slipped between houses or dashed down lanes to repeat what they had seen. But children's whispers were different from adults. They mixed fear with imagination, stretching ordinary details into small legends. A tall traveler became a giant in their retelling. A scar across the face became proof of battles fought. A limp in the walk became the mark of curses, not mystical ones, but stories spun from childish fear. By the time their words reached parents, the traveler's image was larger, darker, stranger than he truly was. These stories shaped the way adults whispered, too. A mother hearing her child claim that a traveler carried a bag that jingled like coins would look at him differently the next day. A father told that the stranger spoke with a growl, would treat him with colder caution. Children's voices, though playful, bent the whispers of their elders. Travelers were aware of the staring eyes, but rarely understood the weight behind them. Some smiled, hoping to soften suspicion. Others ignored the children, thinking them harmless. But children's retellings had power, for in a world where news was scarce, even the imagination of the young carried weight. The boldest children sometimes followed travelers. They trailed behind, giggling at his long strides, daring one another to creep closer. They watched how he adjusted his cloak, how he shifted his pack, how often he turned to glance behind. These details, retold in whispers, gave shape to judgments. He looks nervous. He keeps checking his bag. He walks like someone who doesn't want to be seen. At night, while adults whispered behind closed doors, children whispered beneath blankets. They shared their fears and fascinations. Did you see his boots? They were huge. Did you hear his voice? It was strange. These bedtime whispers kept the image of the traveler alive in young minds long after he had gone, ensuring that his shadow lingered even where he could not. In this way, the eyes of children were not innocent observers, but active creators of the stories that surrounded strangers. Their voices added color to the murmurs, exaggerating, reshaping, and sometimes softening what others had said. A traveler who gave a smile might be remembered kindly for weeks. One who scowled might be turned into a figure of menace for years. For the traveler, children's whispers were invisible but enduring. He walked on, never knowing how his image was being reshaped behind him, not only by wary adults, but by the watchful, restless imaginations of the youngest in the crowd. And so, in the 14th century, even the smallest voices had the power to shape the largest shadows. If whispers began in the streets and markets, they found their truest form in the spaces between neighbors. The 14th century was a time when households leaned close to one another, walls often thin, courtyards shared, and lives overlapping. Gossip was not an occasional act, but a current that flowed daily, carrying news, shaping judgments, and building invisible networks of trust and suspicion. When a traveler passed through, neighbors became both judges and amplifiers, repeating what they saw and sharpening it with each retelling. It often began with a glance from a window. One household caught sight of the stranger as he crossed the lane. The mother whispered to her daughter. The daughter carried the word to the neighbor's boy. And by evening, 3 homes had their own version of the same event. None matched perfectly, but together they created an image stronger than any single set of eyes. Neighbors measured the traveler in silence before they spoke aloud. Was his pack large enough to suggest goods worth guarding, or light enough to suggest hunger? Did he greet those he passed, or keep his eyes lowered? The smallest detail carried meaning. To one neighbor, a lowered gaze meant respect. To another, it meant secrecy. To one, a heavy pack meant wealth. To another, stolen goods. Silence gave way to murmurs, murmurs to whispers, and whispers to a reputation that spread house by house. The most powerful whispers came not from what was seen, but from what was imagined. If the traveler entered a shop and lingered too long, neighbors asked why. If he left quickly, they asked what he avoided. If he walked into an alley, they wondered what business he had there. Whispers filled the gaps between facts, stitching together possibilities until they became, in many minds, the truth. But whispers were not always hostile. Sometimes they tilted toward fascination. A stranger wearing a cloak of unusual fabric sparked wonder. Where did he come by that weave? Is it northern? Could he be a trader? A new pattern on a belt or a satchel stitched in a style unfamiliar to the town became subjects of admiration that neighbors repeated with equal eagerness. Curiosity softened suspicion, though never fully. Neighbors also used whispers to guard one another. In close-knit towns, they felt responsible for each other's safety. If one household mistrusted a traveler, it quickly warned the next. Watch him closely. Don't let your children follow. Keep your door fastened tonight. These warnings spread quickly, faster than the traveler's own footsteps, building a wall of caution that he could not see but would feel in glances and gestures. There were also cases where whispers turned competitive. If one neighbor thought well of a traveler, Another might quietly disagree. He smiled at you, but not at me. He bought from your stall, but not mine. You say he seemed kind, but I thought him distant. These subtle rivalries sharpened the edges of gossip, making the traveler's image shift from house to house, never consistent, never wholly trusted. By nightfall, a traveler's reputation could be settled without his knowing. Families sat around hearths, repeating what neighbors had said. Voices weighed every word. One person spoke of kindness, another of suspicion, a third of curiosity. The whispers layered upon one another until the traveler's shadow grew longer than the lane he had walked. And when the traveler moved on the next day, neighbors still whispered. They remembered the sound of his boots, the tilt of his head, the way he held his pack. They compared him to those who had passed before, stacking stories one atop another until every traveler seemed part of a larger tale of outsiders. The silent weighing of neighbors revealed the truth of the 14th century. No stranger entered a town alone. He was met not only by the eyes before him, but by the voices behind walls, carried house to house until his image was shaped by many hands. For the traveler, whispers were both unavoidable and unseen, weaving his story in the mouths of people he never spoke to, binding him into the life of a place even as he prepared to leave it. Every town in the 14th century had a boundary, though it was not always a wall or a gate. Sometimes it was a ditch dug long ago, sometimes a line of hedges, sometimes only a bend in the road where the last house stood. Wherever it was, people knew it instinctively. Beyond this line began the open road, and with it the endless arrival of strangers. At these edges, eyes lingered longest on travelers. A stranger walking into town from the road was not just entering a place of commerce and homes. He was crossing into the zone where whispers grew sharpest. Farmers returning from fields noticed first. They paused with their tools, squinting at the figure who approached. Children gathering firewood or chasing one another along the edges ran back quickly with news. Even animals reacted, their movements shifting when someone unfamiliar passed by. What made these edges so important was that they were both beginnings and endings. For the traveler, they marked the first test, the first sight that people had of him. For the townsfolk, they marked the first chance to judge. Was this stranger weary, hungry, burdened? Or was he alert, strong, and full of secrets? 1,000 questions rose silently, and the answers began shaping whispers long before the traveler spoke. Some travelers knew this and adjusted their appearance before reaching the edge. They straightened their backs, brushed dust from their cloaks, or slowed their pace to seem less hurried. Others, unaware, walked on without thought, carrying every mark of exhaustion into view. In either case, the watchers at the boundary took note, and from their notes, whispers began to spread inward, flowing like ripples in water. Edges were also places of hesitation. A traveler might stop to drink from a stream before crossing into the first cluster of homes. He might rest his pack on a stone, take a deep breath, or glance around warily. Each pause was observed. To villagers, a pause meant something: preparation, caution, or perhaps guilt. None of these impressions were spoken directly, but all of them slid quietly into murmurs exchanged later. At times, a group of children gathered deliberately near the edge, daring one another to get closer to the stranger. Their laughter, though playful, created the sense that the traveler was already an object of curiosity. Older villagers walking past, shook their heads and whispered to one another about whether the traveler encouraged the children, ignored them, or turned away too sharply. Every gesture mattered, for at the town's edge the stranger's image was fragile and quickly set. When evening fell, the edge became even more significant. A traveler arriving at dusk, with shadows stretching long across the road, inspired deeper suspicion. Why arrive so late? People asked each other. Why not earlier, under daylight? A late arrival seemed to suggest secrecy or desperation. Farmers locking their sheds muttered to neighbors, and women drawing water noted how the figure moved in the dimming light. The whispers that began here often followed the traveler far into the center of town. But departures from the edge mattered too. When a traveler left, villagers watched his back until he disappeared. They whispered about the speed of his stride, the weight of his step, the direction he chose. He left early, before dawn, they said. He lingered too long at the edge, others remarked. Even the act of leaving carried judgments that shaped the memory of his stay. Edges were thresholds not only of land, but of thought. They were the invisible stage where the first impressions of travelers were written and the last lines of their story were whispered. And in a world without paper records or portraits, these whispers mattered more than any mark on parchment. A traveler could walk into a town as one kind of man and leave remembered as another, all because of the way eyes judged him at the edge. For travelers, this boundary was both the simplest and the most dangerous of places. It required no action, no word, no bargain. Yet it was here that people measured him most closely, deciding whether his presence would be met with curiosity, caution, or suspicion. And once decided, those whispers flowed inward like a tide, carrying his reputation deeper than his own footsteps could reach. A traveler might pass through a town in a single afternoon, yet the memory of his presence could stretch far longer than his stay. In the 14th century, stories clung to places and people like smoke to a roof beam. Once spoken, whispers did not vanish easily. They curled through households, markets, and doorways, shaping how strangers were remembered long after their boots no longer touched the streets. The most common whispers were about appearances. Villagers recalled the look of a cloak, the number of patches on a sleeve, or the way a pack sagged with weight. One person said the fabric was thick, another insisted it was worn thin. One thought the pack heavy with goods, another claimed it was stuffed only with straw. These contradictions did not erase each other. They grew together, creating a richer legend of who the traveler had been. More important, however, were the whispers about behavior. People remembered not only what the stranger carried, but how he moved. He walked straight as if on important business. No, he looked over his shoulder, like a man afraid. He was polite when spoken to. No, he was curt, as if he wished not to be noticed. Each impression became a thread in the tapestry of memory, and once woven, those threads remained for seasons, even years. Sometimes whispers became warnings passed down to children. Be cautious of men who arrive at dusk, mothers said. Remember the one who slipped through here years ago. Or don't follow strangers on the road. Remember the tall man who walked too quickly. These stories stretched the life of a traveler far beyond his stay. He became a cautionary tale, his shadow cast over young minds who had never even seen him. Other times, whispers became stories of admiration. Do you remember the one who gave away a coin to the beggar boy? Someone would ask. Or the one who helped lift a cart from the mud? Even small acts of kindness gained weight in memory, repeated in markets until the stranger's name was forgotten, but his gesture remained. In this way, whispers could turn suspicion into respect, if only slowly. The strange thing was that travelers rarely realized the legacy they left. They believed their departure ended their story in that place. They walked on, thinking of the road ahead, never knowing that behind them their image was still being shaped. In kitchens and workshops, people debated their honesty, their wealth, their purpose. In alleys, young apprentices imitated their gait. In fields, farmers recalled the sound of their boots. Whispers stretched time, making a short visit last as long as memory itself. Some whispers even reached other towns. A merchant traveling on might repeat. There was a stranger in the last village, tall, quiet, carrying a strange bundle. Another merchant would carry the same words further, until villages 2 days apart had spoken of the same traveler, adding new details each time. The stranger became a figure larger than himself, moving ahead in whispers just as he once moved ahead in footsteps. In this way, travelers lived 2 lives. One was the real journey, measured in miles and hunger and boots worn thin. The other was the whispered life, measured in stories that grew without their knowledge, stretching long after their departure. The second life often outlasted the first, for whispers had no end unless silenced, and in most cases they were carried forward eagerly. What made whispers so powerful was that they required nothing to survive. They were light enough to pass from one mouth to another, easy enough to slip into casual talk, strong enough to stick in memory. They asked for no ink, no parchment, no seal. And yet, in many ways, they preserved a traveler's story more deeply than written words. A ledger might forget him, but a whisper remembered. And just as whispers once traveled from mouth to mouth across 14th century towns, today these stories travel through this channel to you. If you haven't already, I'll gently remind you to subscribe, so you never miss the next tale carried forward, just like the voices of the past. The departure of a traveler did not bring silence. Instead, it often stirred the town into deeper whispers. A stranger's presence created questions. His leaving left answers uncertain, and uncertainty fed the tongue more than certainty ever did. When dawn broke and a traveler slipped out quietly, people noticed. Farmers on their way to fields saw the footprints still fresh in the mud. Bakers rising early to knead dough glimpsed the fading figure at the edge of the road. By mid-morning, the town was already speaking of it. He left before the sun was high. He carried his pack as if in haste. He looked behind him as he walked. Even the way he departed was judged, and from it new stories were spun. If the traveler lingered too long before leaving, suspicion grew sharper. Why was he reluctant? Villagers asked. Was he waiting for someone? Was he watching us? The pause became an object of fascination. What to the traveler was a simple delay, perhaps tightening a strap, perhaps catching his breath, became a sign of secrecy or hidden intent to those who saw from a distance. The road out of town held as many eyes as the road in. Children dared one another to follow the traveler a short distance, laughing as they chased his shadow. Shepherds noted the direction he took and repeated it later, as if the choice of road revealed some truth about him. Those who had traded with him or shared a brief word weighed his departure more carefully, adding their opinions to the web of whispers. Even his absence left a presence. Houses he had passed seemed quieter once he was gone. Stalls where he had paused carried a faint memory of his shadow. Neighbors compared notes, as though piecing together the final act of a play. He left before eating much. He stayed only one night. He did not bargain hard. From such fragments entire reputations were woven. The strongest whispers were often about what he had not done. If he failed to greet someone, they remembered. If he did not visit a certain shop, they questioned why. If he spoke little, his silence was replayed endlessly, interpreted in every possible direction. Absence of action was as heavy as action itself, and it fueled conversation long after the traveler's boots had carried him beyond hearing. Sometimes the traveler's departure sparked relief. People whispered that the air seemed lighter, that caution could now ease. Other times it sparked unease. They worried about where he had gone, what business he carried, whether his passing signaled the arrival of more strangers. Relief and unease alike kept his presence alive, even when he was far down the road. Days later, whispers still lingered. Farmers reminded one another in the fields. "Do you remember the stranger who left so quickly?" Merchants repeated the story in new tones. He carried a strange bundle. No one knew what it was. Children turned him into a half-imagined figure in their games, chasing one another while shouting, "I am the traveler." His image, reshaped by memory and imagination, walked on long after he had gone. In this way, the end of his visit was not the end of his story. The 14th century left no portraits, no written records of most strangers, but whispers created their own form of memory, binding a traveler to a place even after his body had moved elsewhere. A town could forget the details of his face, but still remember the way he left, the sound of his boots, the shadows he cast across the lanes. For travelers, departure was often freedom, the open road, the next destination. But for those left behind, departure was the beginning of a new chapter of whispers. And so, long after he disappeared down the horizon, his name unspoken, his figure unseen, the traveler still lived on in the murmured words of those who once watched him pass.